But do remember, this is being recorded, so anything you say will be either repeated before the camera or at least muffled somewhere.
Yes.
Alright, so today we're talking about fantasy. So we're talking about fantasy in general. Now when I say fantasy in general, we're going to be talking about the top 5, maybe 6 tips for writing fantasy, and then we're going to go in depth on one of the tips, because one of the tips is make sure that you know what genre and subgenre you're in, because you're going to want to follow those throughout your entire book, because if you jump genres or subgenres, people tend to get weird. Yeah, readers are like, I don't know what happened. I just went from having a realistic fiction novel to suddenly she's being bitten by a vampire at the climax of the book. There were no vampires. Yeah, so that's a problem. So
foreshadowing, use it.
Exactly.
Appreciate it.
Exactly, foreshadowing is important. So that being said, just gonna close this door since I'm a very loud person. If anyone shows up, please open the door. All right. So the 5 tips that I'm going to talk about today, I think the eraser's over here. Great. The 5 tips that I'm going to be talking about today are very basic tips, but then we're going to be going super in depth on genres and subgenres, and you can ask me any questions about the genres and subgenres that you want. And I'm also going to be talking about pitfalls and ways to succeed within said subgenres. Tongue twister there. All right. So the first tip is, as I said before, pick your genre and stick with it. Now, when I say pick genre, I also mean subgenre. Because, yes, you can have a main genre. For example, you could have a steampunk fantasy novel, and that's your main genre. But then you could have a subgenre of supernatural, and therefore you have vampires involved. That's where these complexities and interesting, unique stories come into play. Because you're taking a main genre that's very basic, and then adding a twist that makes it unique, right? Which is obviously what we want. We want our stories to be unique. But at the same time, if you don't stick to this subgenre and this genre's expectations, then generally the readers get a little thrown off. And when I say expectations, I don't mean you have to write it in X, Y, and Z way. I just mean that if you're going to throw things in, you gotta make sure it's properly foreshadowed, you gotta make sure it makes sense, you gotta make sure that it lines up nicely. Because if it doesn't, the reader's just gonna kind of stare and go, huh? And they're gonna be very confused. Trust me, as a person who recently watched a TV show that broke every rule of their genre and subgenre,
Wait, which one?
I wouldn't even recommend it, because it's just bad.
No, then I
now
want
we
to know.
want to know.
Okay,
Don't say it's bad.
It's called Haven. Don't watch it, because the first season was good and everything else sucked. Because then they started being like, guess what? Instead of just doing supernatural, we're going to throw in the apocalypse. Guess what? We're then also going to throw in ghosts. Guess what? We're then also going to throw in, and they just kept throwing things in the pot until finally you're very confused. Yeah, no, there was also zombies and there was also aliens. So it's just like, okay, you gotta stop. You gotta
I mean,
stop.
there was one TV show I was watching, and it turned like most of the better characters LGBTQ, and I'm like, dude, by now it's just tacky. Stop.
It's like if they had been that way from the beginning, that's totally fine.
But it was like straight the first like 5 seasons, and then they just throw in all of these, and I'm like, what happened?
Exactly. See, I
Yes,
think that.
upon a time.
See, I think diversity is definitely very important.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go on a side tangent here briefly. Diversity is super crucial in your books. You should have diversity. You shouldn't have all your characters be, I don't know, Italian or I don't know, Spanish. Like you shouldn't have them be all
have
one.
a bunch of characters Italian?
I don't know. Maybe someone does. But the point is, you should have diversity. There should be diverse people because there are diverse people in existence. However, you shouldn't just throw it in there just to make yourself popular. And I think that's the problem. A lot of people will have like this great cast of characters, and then all of a sudden they're like, no one's watching our show, let's make them lesbian. And it's like, no, that's not.
Like, that's out.
Yeah. Now, if she was a lesbian from the beginning, I have no problem with that.
Yeah.
But if you're throwing it in later just to get people to be interested, that makes me sad.
Yeah.
Because people have more to them than just their sexuality, their gender, and their race.
Yeah.
People
are people.
There's
People
a lot
are
of
should it
diversity
be?
because
you and I should
because
get
everyone
along
looks
so
different because
awfully.
Exactly.
it takes place in like a D&D type of universe. But
Yeah.
I'm not doing it to be popular. I do it
Exactly.
because I want to have fun with this.
Exactly, you want to have fun with this, and it helps give an extra like feeling of depth to your characters, right? To have diversity. I'm all about having diversity for the depth of your characters. I am not about forcing it upon yourself just so that way you can have people like you. That's different. So I agree. Diversity that comes naturally, 100% will absolutely support that. I have so many LGBTQ friends and so many friends of different races, but like, if you're forcing it just to make people like your book, it's not ultimately
it's
gonna
a
be
shame on
sad.
That's just wrong on so many levels.
Exactly. All right. The next thing that we're going to talk about, which doesn't always apply, as we're going to talk about with subgenres and main genres, is magic rules. Now, again, not all fantasy actually has to have magic. I know that's a crazy concept, considering 99% of it does, but we're going to talk about it anyway. So, if your fantasy has magic, then you're going to make sure the magic has rules. And believe it or not, even if you're a discovery writer, you are going to want to plot this out in advance. And by plot, I mean you're going to want to say, here's the rule, here's what happens when you break it, here's all these delineations of how it works. You're going to want to make sure you know how it works, because if you don't know how it works when you're writing it, then later plot holes are going to ensue and you're not going to know how to fix it.
Like onward with like if you take the phoenix string and there's a
So, yes, exactly. You gotta have rules where, for example, if only people with blue hair have magic, then you can't randomly have someone with brown hair have magic. You can't do that. It's your own magic rule you set up, unless
What
you
if
specifically
you dye your
explain.
hair? What happens then?
Exactly. Then you gotta talk about what works if you dye your hair. This
How
is
do
why
you lose
you
your
start
magic if
going
you dye
like
your
this.
hair from blue to something else? Like, oh, I have so many questions.
Well, exactly.
Wait, what
See,
if you
this
dye your
is
hair
important.
from
No, we have to make a
color
story
blue?
about that.
But this is why magic rules are important, because then you can look at every aspect and say, okay, what is important about this? What is not important about this? What is it that people might have questions about? It's important to rule out every obstacle. Otherwise, your readers are going to trip over the obstacles when you get to them. And we don't want our readers tripping and falling on their faces. That's generally not a pleasant experience. All right, next is world building. Now this is essential irregardless of your genre. Why? Because even if you're doing a modern fantasy, like it's in today's society, kind of like Harry Potter, and then it branches off in its fantasy, like there's other parts to the world, but it's in the present day, pretty much. That's how she wrote it, right? You're still going to want to do world building because there's going to be a separate world. There's going to be this world that people don't know about, right? So even if it's in the present, like there could be witches and wizards in the present, but we don't know about it.
They're called authors.
But we don't know about it, right? And if we don't know about it, that means you still have to do some world building to make sure that we know what their world is like within our world. It's kind of like creating a different culture. Therefore, it's still considered world building because it's their own world. It would be like going to another part of the country and then being like, why is everyone dressing like that? Well, that's kind of rude. They dress like that because that's their culture. You know, like to them that is normal. You're the weird one. Like, so it's important to have world building and make the world be in depth. Now, caveat: if you're doing a short story that is fantasy, you don't have to do as much world building. Just make sure that there aren't any plot holes. That's the main issue with short stories. With novels, you want to make sure the world building's done well, but also don't go too crazy because not all people are Brandon Sanderson. He's special.
He's a freaking wizard. I
He's
want
special.
his power.
Yes, exactly.
I have a quick question
Yes,
about world
question.
building.
Go for it.
So, do you just like try to do it in the beginning, or can you develop it over time?
Over time, 100%. Do not do it all in the beginning. That is
Also,
what's
who's that
called.
author you were talking about?
Huh?
What was that author you were talking
Oh,
about?
Brandon Sanderson. He just does a ton of world building, like
He's so
throughout the
freaking
entire book.
Good. Like, what the heck?
But the point is that there are very few people that can do that without losing the reader and getting bored.
Without
Or
losing
their minds.
sanity.
Exactly, or their minds. So yeah, just if you want to try that, go for it, but also be warned. But yeah, with world building, I would 100% say do it throughout. Do not do it all at the beginning, because if you do it all at the beginning, that's going to be what's called an info dump. Now the problem with info dumps is the fact that readers go along with this info dump and they feel like they're reading a textbook about a fantasy universe. And even though that sounds cool to us as authors, to most readers, they just want to get to the story. And so as a result, if you build the world throughout and say, okay, well, you learn about the fact that only blue-haired people have magic in chapter 1. Then in chapter 2, we talk about the fact that if you dye your hair, it does X. Then in chapter 3, like you deep dive as you go. You don't just say, here's all the rules in chapter 1.
In chapter 2, if you dye your hair, then all of your magic becomes dark magic, and you have to become evil in order to
Oh gosh.
Yes.
All right. So, but the
Someone
point
needs to
is,
write a book about that now.
You got it.
but the point is, world building needs to be done throughout. I would not recommend doing it all at the beginning. I would say do the most. I would say when doing world building, make sure you have the most important world building at the beginning. So like if it is absolutely crucial for the plot, put it at the beginning. But anything that is not plot critical, wait till later.
Yeah, just mention it like other.
Oh yeah, just
Yeah.
passing
Yeah.
comments. You can, and the best part is that then the readers can discover it with you. So they feel like they're being given like this beautiful plate of food and they're eating it slowly instead of being given this beautiful plate of food and being told, eat it all right now, 10 seconds. That's how info dumping feels. And that's why it's like, ooh, okay. You know, sometimes we don't want to eat an ice cream sundae until we get a brain freeze, right? We want to eat it slowly and be able to enjoy said ice cream sundae.
Unless if someone just likes that stuff and it's like, okay, I want a book that
Right.
just dumps all
See,
that.
I don't
information.
get brain freezes. My chest freezes up and it sucks.
Gosh. So, with that being said, that's where Brandon Sanderson comes in. He does a lot of like world building as he goes, but it's in like huge chunks. And
Oh,
some
yeah.
people like that. But I will also say it's part of how he does it. That is what makes it work.
It's
Not
just
everyone
so
can make
pretty.
it work. Not saying you can't, just saying it will take a lot of work to get there. Not impossible, just know if you're aiming for Brandon Sanderson, you're gonna need practice.
It's gonna take years.
It's gonna take some time. Alright.
Gonna need it.
Now I know when we're talking about fantasy, we don't like to talk about the real world, but the real world is important. Why? Because you want to have real world elements for your readers to relate to. If your readers can't relate to anything in the story, they aren't going to want to pick it up and read it because they're just going to be like, I don't know about this culture of the I don't know what that means. I don't know what any of this means. This is all confusing and foreign to me. But if you have something like, for example, a real world attribute of this culture may be strange and foreign to you, but they're worshiping a deity, then people who are religious can relate to that, even if it's some strange deity of the octopuses. At least they're aware that, I don't know, it was the first thing that came to my brain. Then at least they're aware, oh, hey, this is familiar to me because I too worship a religion. Or even if they don't, I know people who do. You know, you can feel that real world connection, even if it is a completely different thing. Or, for example, Harry Potter, British boarding schools. That was something a lot of people could relate to, even if you've never gone to a boarding school because you knew they existed, right? It felt like the real world. But then she threw in wizards. Therefore, it made it foreign without being so foreign that just makes your brain explode. So you got to make sure that in the midst of your fantasy, you also have some real world elements that can ground your reader. Because without that grounding, they're just going to fly away and stop reading. All right. That being said, the next tip is character development. I can write character. There we go. With character development, you want to make sure that these characters also have things that people can relate to. Now, when I say things people can relate to, it's the concept in general. So, for example, I don't know why I'm using Harry Potter a lot today. Pardon. If you don't like Harry Potter, I'm sorry. But Hermione, right? She's a know-it-all. We've all dealt with a know-it-all before. Have we dealt with a know-it-all who knows everything about potions and spells? No.
Maybe.
But we have dealt, maybe, who knows? But we have generally dealt with people who are know-it-all in math or know-it-all in history, right? We have people that we know and can recognize that have those traits.
To me, I'm currently everything according to my classmates.
So, as a result, having real-world characteristics can help your characters be more relatable. Or like, for example, Harry Potter. He technically is part of the Quidditch team, right? He's technically, for all intents and purposes, a jock. I know that sounds crazy, but he technically is.
That's just hard to imagine.
I know, but he technically is.
He
plays
looks
a
like a
sport.
nerd.
He plays a sport. He plays a sport, and when it comes to homework, he ignores most of it, right? He's technically a jock.
You broke me.
Wait.
You broke me.
Oh, she's right. Then what the heck?
Goodbye.
I think I broke everyone. All right. So, but
I can
seriously
never
though.
look at Harry Potter the same again.
So, but that's why people related to him was because because they all either knew a jock or are a jock. And that's part of the reason people were able to be like, hey, I feel this character, whether physically or because I know someone like him. And so it added a real world element to a character that otherwise no one can relate to, right? None of us, as far as I'm aware, are generally fighting a Dark Lord and are a chosen one.
You don't know everything about us.
I am
Scared.
I am the Dark Lord.
I mean,
Not
if you
being
count my
Dark Lord.
characters as a part of me, then I absolutely am.
Okay, next is viewpoint. So with fantasy in particular, generally you are deep diving into something that is going to be insane, right? Kind of like Brandon Sanderson stuff. There's so much world building going on that you have to have something to ground you. And even though we've been talking about there's all sorts of ways to ground the character, the ultimate way to ground the reader in, aside from the character, aside from the world building, is the viewpoint. Because if you're jumping viewpoints all the time, you're going to lose your reader pretty quick. However, if you stick with 1 or 2 viewpoints, maybe 3, I think you can get away with more than that, but only if it's later on in the series when people have adjusted a little bit more. Like, for example, Percy Jackson. Entirely from Percy's point of view, the first series, right? But the second series, he jumps around all over the place between like 12 different characters, right? But it's more acceptable because you've already adjusted to the world. So, if you're doing a later on in the series book, that's more acceptable. Or if you're doing like a villain and a protagonist viewpoint, that's also acceptable. But if you're doing 12 viewpoints from book 1,
Ouch.
it's gonna be a
That's
little hard to
painful.
follow. It's gonna be hard to follow, yeah. So it's more just, this is more just for the sake of your reader. I know you might be like, but I can't pick a favorite character. I'm sorry, I'm asking you to.
Then pick one.
I know, I'm asking
Man
you
up
to.
and you pick multiple favorite characters.
You just have to have one main character.
You gotta make it easy to follow. You gotta make sure that your readers aren't lost. Because if your readers get lost, that's when they put down the book. And we don't want that, right? Obviously, we want them to keep reading. Okay.
I mean, once they bought, there's nothing I can do.
That's fair, right? That's fair. All right, so now we're
But
going to
they
talk
don't
about.
read from the library. That's the problem.
So,
Library.
Then
True,
my
libraries are
pity
beautiful.
on the library for buying my book.
so next we're going to talk about genres and subgenres. Now, if you have any questions about these genres or subgenres, please let me know as we're going. We're going to try to go through them pretty quick, but that's mainly because there's like 50 of them and 40 more minutes. So that's why I'm like, questions are welcome, but make sure that you know what the question is before you raise your hand. All right, okay, let's go. So, alternate history, yes, this is a form of fantasy. It is also a form of science fiction. The reason that it is a form of science fiction is because if you use science-based elements or say like, hey, what if the Nazis won World War II? That is science fiction. Whereas,
What?
yes,
How's
that,
it science fiction?
because it is still technically based in reality and facts, and partially science. It is not based in what if the Nazis had dragons and that's why they won. That's when it becomes fantasy.
Why dragons?
I don't know. I'm making crap up as
How
I
would
go.
the Nazis like even deserve dragons? Like,
don't know.
honestly,
I don't-
if we're going by Harshing dragon logic, the dragons will come back once us humans have figured it out. So A, humans figured the frick out I want a dragon, and B, like,
Yeah,
very
there's lots of
confusing.
different-
Unless they
But
put,
I'm just
Unless
making
they
stuff
go
up.
into this,
Unless they put a
the
dragon.
Jurassic period, which birds could fly into big
So-
pterodactyl birds.
So science fiction it can be alternate history, but it can also be fantasy. So alternate history is when you say, what if this historical event happened differently because of dragons, because of magic, because of etc. Fill in the blank. That has to do with fantasy. However, if you're doing alternate history, as in they invented this thing first, then that's an alternate history science fiction because it's based in what if this scientific development happened first. Does that make sense?
Yes and no at the same time.
Okay, that's okay. If you have more questions, please feel free to ask specific questions. All right, the next one also starts with an A, so I'm just going to go like that. Oh, gosh. No. Anthropomorphic fantasy. There we go, that's a long word.
It's a word.
This is when animals take on human qualities. For example, dragonborns in Dungeons and Dragons. They are dragon people, right? They're not dragons, they're not people, they're dragon people. That's different. A lot of people also think of Zootopia. That is absolutely an anthropomorphic fantasy. It's basically when your characters are animalistic humans. Now, you also might feel this is familiar if you've been in my Thursday campaign. That's absolutely an anthropomorphic fantasy. So, that being said, some people find this quite strange, but honestly, if you're doing fantasy races, it's super easy to do anthropomorphic fantasy as a subgenre. And it makes it very easy to create very unique cultures and types of people, obviously, because you're using animals as a baseline.
Yeah, I actually have a few more questions on this.
Yes,
later.
go ahead. No,
Like
you can
later,
ask. Okay.
When we have more time.
Okay, I was gonna say you are more than happy to ask because we're going faster than I
take
thought.
a while.
Okay, cool. All right. If we have some extra time, please remind me. All right, next one. Arcane punk. Now, arcane punk is when magic and science exist side by side and there's equal power for both. So, for example, you can use magic to power a gun, or you can use a gun to cast a spell, or things like that. It's when you can mix science and fantasy equally. They're on equal terms, and they can be switched out, like a battery. You can use magic as a power source and things like that. That is arcane punk.
So would Albatross be an arcane punk?
Kinda. Yeah, it's definitely a subgenre.
Would the Reckoner
Mhm.
series be an arcane?
I haven't read The Reckoner, sorry, I have not. So not familiar.
It might be.
But yeah, there's a lot that can fit under this category, but basically what makes it either science fiction or fantasy is whether one is heavier. When they're pretty equal and can be used pretty interchangeably, that's when it becomes arcane punk.
I
So-
like that title.
I know,
It
right?
sounds
It's
so
the
cool.
coolest title. I agree. Thank you. I'm glad I'm not the only one who thought that when I came across that last night.
Why so many A's?
Because I'm going in alphabetical order.
That makes sense.
All right. So, Arthurian fantasy. Now, this is pretty obvious, but it's still important to talk about. This is, obviously, the Knights of the Round Table type stuff. This is when your fantasy realms delve into King Arthur, the Knights of Camelot, Merlin, Mordred, and Morgana. All those types of people. If you have questions about Arthurian legend, I'm sad now, and please go read it. But with Arthurian legends, the importance is mainly just to make sure that you reference back to the original. So this is very similar to fairy tale fantasy that we're going to talk about later. However, this is specifically for Arthurian legend. Yes, there is such a subgenre/genre called assassin fantasy.
Oh no.
It is actually a genre.
Oh no.
I know.
go.
That blew me away too, especially considering they had like the list that I found when I was going through all these genres had like top ones from this genre, and they sounded good. So with assassin fantasy, it's going to be political struggle is often going to be the center of this fantasy novel. Why? Because obviously the assassin has someone to assassinate, right? And if there's no political struggle, who are they gonna go stab?
They're starting a political
You don't
struggle.
know
This
this
is
is
true.
so
World
we're
War
starting a
III.
political struggle.
Yes.
Oh no. We don't need a third one.
So,
We
yes,
already
we do.
do.
Point being, that in an assassin fantasy, the main point is that there is an assassin or a group of assassins that are either the main character or the people that they are trying to be stopped. So either they're the antagonist or the protagonist, but either way, they are the main center of the plot. Someone is trying to be killed, and they're either trying to prevent it or cause it. All right, next.
Wait,
This one
I have a
isn't going to be
question
what you
about-
think it is. Yes,
I actually have a quick question about the assassin one.
absolutely, go for it.
Is it possible that the protagonist could be an assassin trying to make sure another assassin doesn't kill this person?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Okay, I was just curious about that.
That would just make it extra assassin fantasy.
I'm just reading this for
All right, so now the next is Christian fantasy. Now, when I say Christian fantasy, I don't mean like somehow God is secretly a dragon or something like that. That's not what I'm
That's
talking about.
very odd.
No, that's
No.
not what. Well, yeah, it was a weird thing. I was reading the example, and they're all like, "Yeah, so this isn't like taking Christian principles and making them fantasy. What it is things like Narnia, where Aslan the lion represents Jesus Christ, and things like that. So this isn't Christian fantasy in the regard that you're taking Christian religion and making it fantasy. You're just taking fantasy characters and they tend to represent certain Christian ideals. Does that make sense? Cool, cool. All right,
God has a dragon.
next one.
So
You
strange.
lost me. Wait. Dragons don't make that sound.
Okay, wow, we're just gonna make a bunch of weird dragon sounds. All right. So the next is coming of age fantasy. Now this one's pretty obvious. It's basically where the character is naive, adorable child, and they're like, I want to go on an adventure, and then by the end of the adventure, they're like, that was rough. So they finally matured and become who they were meant to be, but only through insane fantasy-related circumstances.
Only through pain.
Yeah. So think of Percy Jackson and Harry Potter absolutely have a coming-of-age arc in them, so they could be considered a coming-of-age fantasy novel. Sure, that's not their main genre, but it's definitely a part of it. 100%. They're growing up through this fantasy universe and maturing through that fantasy world.
My question is, what about the bees?
Yes.
I thought you were going alphabet.
I am.
To the bees.
There are no bees.
Why are there no bees?
I don't know. There are no bees. I was thinking the same thing. It's kind of weird. There were no bees.
I thought that said crossword.
Nope, there's an L. But yeah, no, Crossworlds Fantasy. Now, here's a side note. Crossworlds Fantasy and Portal Fantasy are actually different things. Crossworlds Fantasy is things like Narnia, where you go through a door to end up in another universe, or you go through some sort of crazy ritual and end up in another universe. However, Portal Fantasy, which we're going to talk about later because alphabetical order, is where you physically go through a portal to get to where you're going. So they are slightly different actually, and the reason they're different is because portals often then pop up or disappear, and that's how they get from place to place. Whereas with Crossworld Fantasy, it's just there's a place, they get from A to B, A to B by going through said place, whatever it is.
So an example of crossroad is kind of smart.
Yes,
An example of
Portal Fantasy.
Portal Fantasy is the Black Hole Pages series.
Yes, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well done. Yes. So there we go. Let's see. Next is everyone's favorite dragon fantasy. Now,
There we
literally,
go.
it's pretty obvious what this means. It means dragons are central to the plot. Whether they're a main character, whether the main character raises a dragon, the point is dragons are so essential that the plot would not exist without them. So think of things like Bursinger. That's absolutely a dragon fantasy.
Wings of fire.
Wings of Fire, dragon fantasy.
How to Train a Dragon.
How to Train
How to Train Your
Dragon
Dragon,
fantasy.
baby.
Yes, so these are all ones where it
Typically
doesn't even
that's
have
a
like.
movie though.
Well, actually, it's a book series.
Yeah.
It's based on a book series.
Everything is.
Yeah. So with the How to Train Your Dragon stuff though, right? They don't actually have physical magic. They just have dragons.
And they're the best dragons ever.
So that's why it's called a dragon fantasy. It's because there's technically no other fantasy elements, just dragons. Just dragons. Need I say more? All right. Next one. Dying Earth fantasy. Now this one's kind of more dark. With the Dying Earth fantasy, basically it is either on physical Earth or on a different planet where the Earth is dying and they don't know how to deal with it. And it's how the characters are coping with this dying Earth. It can be like the magic is dying with the Earth and so they don't know how to cope because they're losing their magic. It can be that they are starting to gain powers because the Earth is dying and it was the only thing keeping them from gaining magic. All sorts of different things. Basically just fantasy where the Earth is perishing, and the question is, will they survive or will they perish with it?
They will perish with it.
Yes.
Quick question about that. Would that be kind of like a dystopian type of book?
Yes. Can be. Doesn't have to be, but it can be. With dystopia, typically it's more just a society that is trying to fix something that's wrong with society by making it worse.
Well, fixes. Yay, it's better. No, it's worse.
Exactly, it's actually worse. Like for example, with
Mistborn.
with Mistborn, or with Hunger Games, where it's like, hey, we're going to try to make the world better by just assigning people to these districts, and instead everyone's miserable. So, I would say Dying Earth definitely could be a dystopian, but I wouldn't say it necessarily is dystopian. Dystopian fantasy, speaking of which, is our next one. So with dystopian fantasy, this gets kind of wonky. You can do a lot of different things with dystopian fantasy. For example, one of my favorite dystopian fantasy novels is called The Unwanteds. With The Unwanteds, the whole concept is that they live on these string of islands in another fantasy universe where creativity is banned. Why is creativity banned? Because it's too powerful. You can literally summon magic using your creativity. And so they're like, no, we ain't having that. And so instead, what they end up doing is they try to kill off anyone with creativity, but instead they end up getting rescued by this school for creative people that's technically not supposed to exist. And so they end up learning different things about magic, like the fact that there's this kid that he can draw art so well that it comes to life, and things like that. So, awesome concept, but at the same time, dystopian.
Brandon Sanderson would be an actual wizard.
Yeah, he'd be an actual wizard. He'd be a legit, like, warlock. Alright, so, yeah, with dystopian fantasy, this is where you can either go into another fantasy universe, or you can do a different kind of dystopian fantasy. There's one that I read recently that's independently published. I would highly recommend it, even though it is a little dark, called When Death is Coming. And it's a dystopian fantasy. It doesn't delve deep into the fantasy in the first book, but the second book is coming out soon. But with the dystopian fantasy, it's basically if modern day people learned through magic means when they're going to die and what they do about it. And so the magic is kind of these pillars that kind of foretell your death. And it's kind of fascinating.
Wait,
So,
what if one person was against that and they like didn't do X, so they didn't die, it's gonna spin.
they actually talk about that in the book. It's fascinating. It's very cool. So, no spoilers, but they actually talk about that in the book.
I do have a
So, yes, go for it.
question with that.
Mhm.
So have you read the Giver at all?
I have, yes.
So would that be a
Regular dystopian.
Okay, because because I thought it was a utopia. Well, they think it's a utopia,
think
but
it's
it's
a-
actually a dystopian.
That is what dystopia is. Dystopia is when they think it's a utopia, but it's not.
Okay.
That is literally the definition of dystopia.
Okay, I just wanted to.
No, yeah, you're all good. It's good to clarify these things. So, dystopia is basically when, like I said, they try to make the world a utopia, try to make it better, and it's not better. It's messed up. For whatever reason, it's messed up. So yes, that is a great, what's the word? You identified that beautifully. There we go. I'm just going to say it differently because my words were not coming out right. All right. Okay, that was a long one. But fable / fairy tale / legend. I know the last one technically isn't an F, but they're basically all the same thing. So, fable / fairy tale / legends. This is basically when you retell something that has already been told before. So, for example, if you're retelling the story of Cinderella, fairy tale fantasy. If you're retelling the story of the tortoise and the hare, fable fantasy. If you're retelling the legend of some crazy spider goddess, legend retelling fantasy. This is basically where you're retelling a story that has already been told in a new and unique way. Now, this is why it's typically a subgenre or a main genre, because you cannot just have one. You gotta have two. Otherwise, you're just retelling Cinderella, and there's been about 1,000. We need something unique about it, you know? There needs to be something that makes us want to read it that didn't make us want to read it before. So, a great example of that would be like Cinder. It is science fiction Cinderella. So it's a fairy tale retelling that is also science fiction. All right, next one. This one actually I thought was kind of fascinating. Fantasy of manners. This is when the fantasy elements are more dramatic than they are action-based. So in other words, for example, if there's a fantasy ability that can like make people not speak of something, and so it's a Regency romance, and the guy's like, he kisses her, and then he's like, you can't speak of this scandal. She's like, but, now I don't know what to do. Yeah, sorry, I can't deal with drama. If you can't tell, I kind of mock it a little bit. I would happily read your drama, but I cannot write it myself.
I agree with the monkey because that's basically what drama is.
I know it's true.
Dramatic
It's lots
flair.
of tea, all the drama, all the gossip. Yes, so basically fantasy of manners is when romance and drama are the key elemental plot points, but fantasy is involved somehow, whether it be witchcraft, whether it be the guys are warlocks and the ladies are just pawns in their game, or the ladies are witchcraft based and the men are just pawns in their game.
Yes.
Like, it's all sorts of different ways that this can be done. As long as drama is the focal point. It's the center. Alright, next one. This one just has a really cool name, but I promise it's less cool than it sounds.
Oh, that's sad.
I know.
So why are you doing it?
Because I have to do them all. I feel like I have to do them all. Flintlock fantasy. Now, flintlock fantasy is literally where flintlock pistols are involved.
What?
In a fantasy universe. Yes, you did hear me right. That is simple as it gets. Yes, I agree. Your confused face fits my mood perfectly.
So what is a flintlock? That's my question.
It's a type of pistol. It's basically just a really low age type of pistol. You know how we have like automatic rifles now? It's just the really
the main
old kind.
genre, and you could just make it about that.
Yeah, you could
That
literally
makes no
just make it
sense.
about, basically it's magic, but then the people who are either trying to stop the magic or whatever have the pistols.
That won't work.
It does work though.
If you're gonna name it
So-
something less cool.
I know, I'm like, don't name it something this dope when it's not
Flintlock
actually cool.
fantasy. The magic should be based around gunpowder.
Yes, exactly.
I am
I'm
enraged.
upset. Yes, I agree. I'm upset. It sounds awesome, but it's not. Alright, futuristic fantasy. Now, this is obvious. This is when something fantastical changes our future. So, for example, today, right now, what if magic suddenly occurred and we started like casting fireballs? How would that change our future?
Society would crumble.
Exactly. So that's when you do a futuristic fantasy.
dystopia.
Or what if a dragon
Or a
launched
pile
out
of
of the
ashes.
sky right now? Like, that would be a futuristic fantasy where you're saying, what would tomorrow look like if fantasy existed today? That's futuristic fantasy. It's kind of a fascinating concept that I don't see a lot of. Alright, next one. This is also just a sad one.
Gas lamp.
This is where you have fantasy with gas lamps.
That's the best thing ever.
So,
Screw this, man.
this is when it basically is fantasy taking place in the Victorian era, except they didn't want to call it Victorian fantasy, so they called it gas lamp fantasy.
It's called Victorian fantasy.
I know, like Victorian fantasy would be much cooler than gas lamp
Gas
fantasy,
lamp
but
is the
alright.
coolest name I've ever heard.
Oh, right. And then you have heroic fantasy. This is kind of a classic, but it's important to talk about because not always is the protagonist the hero, right? Sometimes they're a morally gray person. Sometimes they actually evolve to be the villain. Like, you don't know.
No.
So, the courageous superhero goes on some sort of quest that has to do with fantasy or supernatural setting. That's what a heroic fantasy is. It can be modern, it can be past, it can be present, it can be future, as long as they are the hero going on a quest. That's pretty much all fantasy novels, but still, we gotta talk about it because it's not all fantasy novels. Now, this one is different from alternate history fantasy. Alternate history fantasy is where you change history using fantasy. So like I said earlier, what if dragons had been used to win the Civil War or something like that?
What if the imagined dragons are actual dragons?
Or actual dragons. There you go. See, like
No
that.
wonder their music's so good.
Exactly. So then it takes history and it changes it and how it would look because of fantasy. Now this, on the other hand, doesn't change history. It just already exists. So for example, what if during the Salem witch trials there were actual witches? That's
Oh,
a
that would be
historical
fun.
fantasy. Or like, what if all the people who are in Parliament during World War I are secretly warlocks and witches?
Yes.
So it's like history stays the same, but fantasy is interlaid with it. It flows with it. So instead of changing it, it flows with it. So there we go. Next is magical realism.
What if the Parliament during the American Revolution were a bunch of goblins?
Oh my gosh, that's scary. All right, so magical realism.
What type of goblins? Gob.
So this is modern day with a twist. So for example, Instead of doing like, what if a dragon popped through the sky right now, what would happen in 20 years? That's futuristic fantasy. This is, what if a dragon popped through the sky right now, how would we handle it in this exact second?
I would ride the dragon and raise it as my own. It would be my baby.
So that is magical realism, where you take something that is real, that is modern, that is present, and you add a magical element into it. Alright. Now with magical realism, it does tend to be primarily realism with a fantasy twist. It's not fantasy that happens to be in reality. It's realism with a fantasy twist. Alright. And that being said, then of course we have medieval fantasy. This is your classic. They live in a medieval timeline. Dragons exist because it's medieval, but then we don't know where dragons went because it's medieval, so it's so old. And yeah, this is your classic. This is the classic quintessential fantasy novel. It's pretty much going to be a medieval fantasy. That's part of the reason why people aren't doing it anymore, is because a lot of people did it. Not saying that you can't do it, but just saying that if you are going to do it, you gotta come up with your own twist on it, because a lot of people have done that. Yes, question?
So, well, how do you figure out which genre yours is, or do you wait to find out what it is at the end of the book?
If you're a discovery writer, generally you figure it out at the end of the book, or you have it in your idea. So like, if you explain to me what it sounds like you give me a 5-sentence synopsis of your book, I can probably figure out what genre it is, just based on that. So that's generally how you're able to figure it out, but some discovery writers don't figure it out to the end. That is correct. All right.
Yeah, probably won't.
So next is military fantasy. This is when there's a war going on and violent battles and intrigue are the main plot. So before, when drama was the main of the plot, that's a different genre. But this is when action is the main of the plot. People are actively stabbing each other for some sort of war-related reason.
Not just for fun.
And as a result, it is a military fantasy, whether that be that warlocks are generals or whatever, or dragons are what you ride into battle.
Fun.
Like, there's all sorts of different ways you can do this. But basically, you take war and make it fantasy. Now, I will say beware with military fantasy. I would do some research, because you don't want to glorify war. It's not a pretty thing. It's just not. Alright, but if you're gonna write it, just write it well. Now, there's also mythic fantasy. Now, mythic fantasy is pretty basic. This is Percy Jackson in a nutshell.
Okay, who is Percy Jackson?
You don't know who Percy Jackson is?
I'm just gonna go cry in a corner, it's fine.
Where have you been living?
Watch the books before you watch the movies, and if you don't know, watch the movies.
Anyway, point is,
Like
Percy
what-
Jackson is the son of Poseidon. He is dope, you should read the series.
Okay, what is it rated? Sorry, I just
No, you're all good. It's like, I would say the first series is PG, whereas the second series is more PG-13 because it does get a little darker.
Okay, yeah, I just have to.
No, yeah, you're all good, you're all
I have
good.
to make sure it's not I read.
No, yeah, I mean, I don't remember there being anything bad in it. I had my parents read it when I was in like middle school, so I feel like it was good. So, I don't know. It's been a while. Like I said, I read it in middle school, but still. So, wow. I've never met anyone who hasn't read Percy Jackson. That's awesome.
So weird.
I think I broke everyone.
You're okay. You're okay. I'm just excited to have you read it now because it's good. But anyway, so mythic fantasy is when you take mythology and you turn it into some form of your fantasy. So whether it's Zeus and the gods are real, like in Percy Jackson, where they're actively still having kids and still exist in this time period, or whether it's, hey, he's a reincarnation of this god or goddess, and he has to deal with the fact that being a human sucks. That's also mythology.
I feel that.
mythological base. And
Or
so,
having them be like a descendant of them and have
yes, or having them be a
fight giants.
descendant of a god and trying to fight a giant stubborn. Black Gold Pages, that is
Points
one.
if you do Norse mythology or
Yes.
Celtic mythology. One of the two. Points.
True. But yes, so for me personally, I like Blackwell Pages even more than I like the Percy Jackson series, but then again, I also have Nordic ancestors, so it could just be my genes being like, my people. So, but yes, I like the Blackwell Pages a lot. It is fantastic. I really love it. All right. So, now this one's
I
fun.
know, because you will not shut up about finding book 3.
No, okay, I have enough money to buy it.
That's nice.
This is a genre, believe it or not. It's called New Weird Fantasy.
That's such a
That's amazing.
So COVID.
That's such a
New Weird Fantasy is when you literally take fantasy concepts that don't fit in any of the categories that I have listed or will list. You're just like, it fits nowhere. You have no idea why, it just doesn't fit anywhere. You're just looking at it going, I have no idea what this is. That's new weird fantasy. Good luck trying to do it just because there are so many defined genres as of this point, but if you find an undefined genre, welcome to the world of new weird fantasy. So, feel free to take on the challenge if you wish.
Okay.
Alright, so next is paranormal fantasy. This is your classic vampires, werewolves, ghosts, and ghouls. Your classic Halloween base.
Vampires be cool though.
Vampires are pretty cool. Alright, so that's paranormal fantasy. Next is political fantasy. Now this is different.
Oh boy.
So political fantasy is actually different from fantasy of manners. Fantasy of manners is where the politicalness in drama is part of the plot. However, this is where the politics is the plot. So for example, they're having a war against these other people, and instead of showing the war, you're showing, we have to make a peace treaty. No, I refuse to make a peace treaty with those terrible people.
Those barbarians.
Those barbarians, there we go. I was like, those barbarians, there we go.
I just realized you're pointing towards me.
I always gesture towards this wall. I don't know why. But yes, so fantasy of manners is more drama, whereas political fantasy is literally politics. The only problem with this is that it's incredibly hard to write if you have no political background. I would recommend starting to watch lots of political shows. It's very difficult to pull off because politics are complicated.
Oh my gosh, freaking politics, they're insane.
Just gonna cry in a corner, it's fine. Alright, now we already talked about this earlier, but portal fantasy. Now, with portal fantasy, this is where a physical portal literally takes you from point A to point B. It's different from Crossworlds because with Crossworlds, magic takes you from point A to point B. This is a physical portal to another dimension / realm / place. Is that good?
That actually makes a lot of sense.
I know, right? It makes a lot of sense.
It's just simple.
It's
Portal.
very simple,
You go
exactly.
in.
Yes,
It's
yes.
one of the more simple ones.
Alright, quest fantasy. Now this is slightly different from heroic fantasy because this is when the characters have to go on a quest to save the day, but they don't necessarily have them as heroes. They're just average people going on a quest. Like they become heroes throughout the quest, but they don't start out as, I'm going to save the realm. They're like, I have to go on this quest because if I don't, the world's gonna end. Guess it has to be me.
The Blackwell pages.
Yes, the Blackwell pages again.
You shut up about the Blackwell
Okay.
pages.
I don't mind it. I don't mind it. I don't mind it. I really do like it. But
Oh yes, not you, but him who has not shut up about it.
I'm glad he likes
in
it
a
so much.
week.
I haven't brought it up in like 48 hours.
Oh,
At least.
No.
Okay.
I've asked
Okay.
people to help me
Getting
find book
back on the
3.
next topic. Okay, we do have book 3 at the library.
Yeah.
So
Just
need to put
check it out.
Yes,
So-
I'm probably gonna check that out.
All right. So romantic fantasy. Now this is pretty obvious. It's where fantasy then causes them to fall in love somehow, or they live in a fantasy universe and they fall in love. So this is like, there's an elf and there's a human, and the elf is like, you're very cute, but I can't be with you because I'm like 200 years old and you're like 20. And
That's concerning.
But then at the same time, I look like I'm 20, and you're attracted to me, so I don't know what to do. That's a romantic fantasy.
Don't date. The age difference.
There are fantasy elements. I know. I don't know why. It's a thing people like to do. So
Or
it's where
convert
there are
elf years to human years
Yes.
like we do dogs and cats.
exactly. In which case, he technically would be 20.
Yeah.
But so
The other
it's
elf.
really not hard.
So with romantic fantasy, it is where romance is the main plot, but fantasy is definitely part of your universe, whether it's a subtle fantasy universe or a major fantasy universe. Like your Prince Charming comes riding in on a freaking dragon.
Yes.
that is
That's
a
the
romantic
story I
fantasy.
would read.
Like, I need this. All right,
We need
next.
more dragons.
Steampunk fantasy.
Wait, didn't we already go through this one?
We did not. I just mentioned it in
was
passing.
mentioned?
Fantasy. So the difference between steampunk fantasy and gaslamp fantasy, or Victorian fantasy as I think it should be named, is that steampunk is a specific genre, whereas Victorian is more a time period. Victorian is the time period in which steampunk kind of became popular. However, steampunk is basically saying, what if all those steam inventions that they made actually worked and like became the whole thing of society? So like instead of discovering electricity and all that, we're like, nah, we have steam power. Screw that. No electricity for us. And so we have everything run off of steam and things like that. On top of that, it just has really cool vibes. I like steampunk vibes. If you ever look up steampunk stuff, it's fun. It's cool. Alright, next. Superhero fantasy. Now why I say superhero fantasy. Superheroes can be science fiction or fantasy. For example, a scientific superhero would be Bruce Banner. Gamma rays turned him into the Hulk, right? That's a superhero fantasy because you're taking a superhero and using science to turn them into a hero. Now, superhero fantasy is when fantasy turns them into a superhero. So, for example, this superhero, I don't know, has the genes of Poseidon, and that's why they become superheroes, because they're Poseidon's kid.
What's
That is,
Superman?
or technically Superman's also science fiction because he's an alien.
Oh yeah.
So I like where you're going, but he's also technically science fiction, even though he feels not science fiction.
Wait, what if he is not fantasy though?
See, a lot of people debate that. So with superhero fantasy, it's where fantasy gives them the superpowers, not science. If you have any sort of sciencey explanation, it's automatically science fiction. If it's, hey, we are going to use ancient dragon blood to turn you into this cool dragon superhero, that's superhero
Sick.
fantasy.
What? But why did you kill the poor dragon?
No, I'm just saying like Jurassic Park, like it's already dead.
Maybe the dragon died of natural causes, and they found like, ooh, dragon blood. If that's the case, that's creepy as frick. But like, who am I to judge?
It's also creepy. All right, next one. This is pretty
that?
obvious.
What is
swashbuckling fantasy?
Pirates!
aka pirates. Yes, this is literally just where pirates.
You technically do that with privateers.
Yes and no. The difference is with swashbuckling, it is pretty much exclusively pirates.
Okay, because privateers are technically pirates.
Privateers
Sort
are
of
technically
queen.
pirates. You could do privateers, however, it's slightly less exciting just because then you have to involve the politics of being with a certain person and technically having to follow their laws while still being a pirate.
Pirates.
It's a tricky balance. So I would say you could absolutely do it. You're just going to have to look a lot more into privateers and how they work. Because they actually do work distinctly differently from pirates, even though they claim to be the same thing.
Okay.
It's kind of fascinating. So, with swashbuckling fantasy, pirates are involved somehow, whether they're a privateer or a regular pirate, or whether they're poor Captain Jack Sparrow who cannot function to save his life. So,
It's Hook. All right.
It's Captain Hook.
Captain Hook
very
is
happy.
also definitely a swashbuckling fantasy because he is what it is. All right, this one.
Oh my gosh, I love Captain Hook.
But what is his real name?
Peter.
A lot of people say
No,
it's James.
No, it's
Anyway, moving on.
Yeah.
it's
This
really-
is funny because it sounds like science fiction, but it's not. Sword and Planet.
Yeah, but really sounds like something.
Sounds like
Or
science
just
fiction.
sciencey.
So, basically, the reason why it sounds like science fiction is because it's science fiction fantasy.
It's
It's
because
both.
the word planet is in there.
Yes,
Yeah.
also that. So,
Sword. Yeah.
for example, a good example of this is Treasure Planet. That's
Oh.
yes, where fantasy elements take place in a science fiction universe. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Solid.
Now looking back at Treasure Planet, it makes no sense but all sense.
But all sense, exactly. It's one of those ones where you're like,
Humans and animals
all right.
and robots and aliens and everything.
Because that
in
makes
between.
sense. Oh, another sword one.
Yep.
Sword and sword.
Sword and sorcery. So, with sword and sorcery, this is typically where a sword-wielding protagonist or antagonist is trying to defeat a sorcerer-wielding villain or protagonist. Generally, it's a sorcerer villain trying to be defeated by a sword-wielding protagonist, but you can switch it up. Generally, though, the reason why its protagonist is sword-wielding and the villain is sorcery-wielding is because it's cooler when they defeat them with just a sword. Because they don't got magic, but they're just that good. Yeah, so it's cool. But
How do you defeat someone with magic with just sword?
exactly.
With skill, plan, and a whole ton of luck.
Mostly
And
the
plot
luck
armor.
thing.
plot armor.
And plot armor.
Is that
All right,
how-
urban fantasy. Now, urban fantasy is where the modern world, and particularly within a city, collides with supernatural / fantasy. So, example would be like a detective in New York, in a big, huge city, finds out that there is a gang of vampires. That would be an urban fantasy. Generally, these tend to be a little bit more dark, a little bit more gritty, because they're, in the city, but they're trying to deal with fantasy elements, and so it gets a little weird. Alright, next. And it's gonna start, okay, it's funny. They were all in alphabetical order, and then for some reason they decided to do it in alphabetical order again, doing different genres. So it's gonna go back to not being in alphabetical order, and I'm sorry about that.
Oh no.
So next is Weird West. Now this is when you take the West
And put weird in
and
it.
put weird fantasy stuff in it. So in other words, I'm a cowboy, but my lasso is made of fairy dust. I don't know.
So this makes zero sense.
Yeah, that's why it's called Weird West and not Fantasy Western.
But that makes no sense.
Well, you have a lightsaber instead of just like a gun.
Yeah, it's pretty weird. It's weird. There's magic involved in a Western setting. Now this one is actually really fascinating. I've never heard of it before, but it's actually really cool. So, wuxia fantasy. Now this is actually a traditionally Chinese fantasy genre that not a lot of people in America have gotten into, which makes me sad because it actually sounds really cool. So wuxia fantasy involves someone who is an expert in martial arts and uses it to defeat foes that have magic wielding abilities. So this is similar to sword and sorcery, except they're literally just using their freaking bad A moves. They're just using freaking martial arts to kick butt and take names against warlocks and witches.
Okay, that is a book I would read.
Exactly, it sounds cool. I'm like, I don't know why more people in America don't do it. It's apparently a primarily Chinese culture thing. Maybe that's why. Maybe people are just too afraid to mess it up. All right, so next.
So messes it up and then war starts.
So,
Yeah, we don't need that.
comic fantasy. Now this is typically more of a subgenre. It's basically where whatever you're doing with your fantasy world beforehand, whatever other genre you picked, it is now hilarious as heck. And you're laughing your butt off.
Oh no.
So war's going on and now you're just all laughing.
Not necessarily. It's more
It's
just,
dystopia, but it's comic.
oh gosh. I mean, theoretically all these could be done. It would just
Well,
be
no,
very
it's
difficult.
like that one scene in Mistborn 1. I won't spoil too much because, again, not
No,
that
I'll plug my ears.
Okay. Where, like, the one character has this, like, street slang thing.
Yes. He's adorable.
Right?
As a character, just because he's so freaking funny, you're just like, you poor thing.
Right? And all the characters are, like, joining in on the weird talk. Dude turns to Dawson, he's like, I think they've gone insane. And then Dawson starting with the street thing. It made me laugh out loud.
That's true, it's funny. So, there can be comic added into almost anything, but comic fantasy is typically when it's actually like that's the purpose of your fantasy. Alright, dark fantasy. Now this might seem pretty obvious, but it's actually slightly different. This isn't just when your fantasy world is slightly like dark and moody. This is like horror-esque fantasy.
Heck yeah.
This is when you have monsters and magic that you're legitimately terrified of. That's dark fantasy. Alright, next is epic fantasy. Now with epic fantasy, massive and intense world building with a quest that takes place over an entire series and not just one book, aka Brandon Sanderson. Or Lord of the Rings as well. So epic fantasy is literally an epic. You cannot wrap it up in one novel. You have to take several novels to wrap up their quest. And the world building is generally so deep and so insane that trying to remember it all would make your head explode. Alright.
Oh no, I think Jimmy would manage.
Did you hear that sound outside?
What sound?
Oh, those sneezes.
Yeah.
I'm like, what was that?
Alright, I'll be honest, I am very distracted. Alright, grimdark fantasy. Now, grimdark fantasy is when you have a morally gray character who lives in a violent and cynical world. Fantasy is involved, but typically it's in a more violent, cynical type vibe, and the main character has been lived in this violent, cynical world so long they've become morally gray. They're not innocent and you know, I want to be the perfect person. That's generally not how it works in Grimdark. Alright, next. Hard fantasy. Now with hard fantasy, this is when a complex, layered fantasy with different magics, different powers, different world niches. This is basically epic fantasy on steroids. This is when you pump up your world building so much that the person physically needs a map and a guidebook at the back of the book to keep track of what's happening. Rarely is this successful purely because of the fact that it is very hard to do successfully. Not impossible, but it is just very difficult. It is hard for a reason. It is hardcore. Alright, next is high fantasy.
The fantasies and drugs.
Nope.
Oh, no.
Alright, so high fantasy is when it is set in an alternative world with magic rules and laws that often go along with epic fantasy. So high fantasy and epic fantasy tend to get mistaken for each other purely because of the fact that high fantasy, it basically just means the world is complex, whereas epic fantasy means the plot and the world is complex. So they generally tend to be intertwined. Alright, next is juvenile fantasy. I'm not going to bother writing it down because we're running out of time. So juvenile fantasy is kid-friendly fantasy. So think Fablehaven. Fablehaven's great, but it's definitely meant for kids. Like the darkest it gets, I still think 12 to 13-year-olds could definitely handle. So this is more meant for, like I said, middle school age kids, sometimes even younger when they say juvenile fantasy. Depends on the age group for juvenile fantasy. For example, Magic Treehouse is definitely a juvenile fantasy. Next is low/mundane fantasy. Now this is when it is set in a world that is pretty much exactly like our world, but there's hints of magic in the present world we're in. So for example, if we lived in exactly this same world, we can't communicate by magic, we don't have magic, but we know how to do potions. It's a tiny hint of magic in our regular world. That's a mundane fantasy. Alright, and the last one is young adult fantasy. This is when it is typically geared more towards teens. This is when dark fantasy is more acceptable because dark fantasy tends to be a little bit more easy to palate as a teen. Not everyone can, but it's a little bit more acceptable to do dark fantasy for a young adult. Okay.
No, have a 5-year-old read a dark fantasy.
No.
Nightmares. Alright, so that being said, I've ended almost exactly on time. Please, everyone, remember that on July 29th, we have our all-day writers conference. If you can come to even part of it, please do. It'll start at 10:30 a.m. and it'll end at 6 o'clock p.m. If you want to come for any part of it, I would love to have you there. Okay? And for the story contest, those are due on July 20th. Alright?
I'm so close with it. And